The 5 battleships of the Montana-class were the last of their kind ordered by the U.S. Navy. With a standard displacement of 60,500 tons, they were nearly a third larger than the preceding Iowa-class. The Montanas were intended to have a main battery of 12 16-inch 50-caliber guns, 3 more guns than the preceding U.S. battleship classes. Protection against underwater weapons and shellfire was also greatly enhanced. They would have been the only new World War II-era U.S. battleships to be adequately armored against guns of the same caliber as their own. Completion of the Montana class, along with the preceding North Carolina, South Dakota, and Iowa classes, would have given the U.S. Navy a total of 17 new battleships, a considerable advantage over any other nation. The Montanas also would have been the only American ships to come close to equaling the massive Japanese battleships Yamato and Musashi. However, the U.S. Navy's urgent requirements for more aircraft carriers, amphibious and anti-submarine vessels resulted in suspension of the Montanas in May 1942, before any of their keels had been laid. In July 1943, when it was clear that the battleship was no longer the dominant element of sea power, their construction was altogether cancelled. During the interwar period, the U.S. Navy was primarily concerned with its rival in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy. The International Naval Arms Limitation System, initiated by the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, had given the U.S. Navy superiority over Japan. After the 10-year construction holiday that had been imposed by the Washington Treaty expired, the U.S. Navy began building the North Carolina-class fast battleships in 1937. This class was intended to replace the pre-World War I battleships that were by then obsolete. But by the late 1930s, the Washington Treaty system, which had been extended by the First and Second London Naval Treaties, had begun to break down after Japan refused to sign the Second London Treaty in 1936. This prompted the other major naval powers to begin rearmament programs, beginning in the United States with the South Dakota class in 1938. Funding for the first 2 new ships was provided in 1937, though work would not commence until 1939. In 1938, Congress authorized 2 more South Dakotas, and also authorized the construction of what would be the first 2 Iowa-class battleships, even though the design had yet to be started. With this design, the Navy sought larger, faster ships that would exceed the 35,000-ton limit on battleship displacement imposed under the Washington Treaty system. Because Japan had already refused to abide by the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty, and intelligence suggesting that Japan was in the process of building several ships, the Yamato and Musashi, which clearly violated all the previous aforementioned treaties, the other major naval powers moved to loosen the restrictions on their own new battleship designs. As U.S. Navy designers worked on proposals for new ships, 2 distinct designs emerged: a slower, heavily armed and armored variant, and a much faster but lighter armed and armored variant that was primarily intended to deal with Japanese cruisers and counter the fast Congo-class battleships. The second variant, which eventually emerged as the Iowa-class, was basically an improved South Dakota design, but with an overall speed of 33 knots. At the same time, work on the first variant proceeded. The General Board intended for it to become the next generation of standard-type battleships, after the Iowas. Navy leadership knew that war was approaching and more than likely unavoidable, and so the need for new ships had become pressing. The first 2 ships ordered in 1939 of the 33-knot improved South Dakota design were USS Iowa and New Jersey. The passage of the 2 Ocean Navy Act on July 19, 1940, provided significant increases to the Navy's strength. When the Navy began designing the Montana class, it was clear to naval leadership that the Iowas were exceptions to Navy doctrine, and that a reversion to the 27-knot standard-type battleship would occur with the next design. The primary consideration for this new class was the development of the 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell. Standard design practice of the U.S. Navy stated that battleships should be immune to guns of their own calibers at expected battle ranges. The new armor-piercing shell had significantly better penetrating power. None of the existing designs, from the North Carolina to Iowa classes, were protected against the 2,700-pound shell, and the General Board wanted the next design to be protected against it. They requested proposals from the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair that met the 45,000-ton limit, were armed with 12 16-inch guns, and capable of 27 knots. The Bureau of Construction and Repair worked through many different design ideas. Some of these included taking the South Dakota design and adding a fourth turret, changing the desired secondary battery from 5-inch guns to 6-inch guns and reducing the number of barrels, and two designs altering the main battery turret configurations between quadruple and triple mounts. All of these proposals were only protected against the old 2,250-pound armor-piercing shell. None of the designs put forth could adequately protect the new class without going drastically over the tonnage limit, and therefore they were all deemed unacceptable. There were also concerns about the feasibility of quadruple turrets. Other guns were suggested, ranging from 16-inch, 56 caliber guns to 18-inch guns, but the 18-inch gun was ruled out after it was realized that only 6 guns could be mounted within the 45,000-ton displacement limit. Some proposals experimented with mixed quadruple, triple, and double turrets for either 10 or 11 guns to save weight, but still increase firepower over the 9-gun South Dakota and Iowa classes. With the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939, all of the constraints imposed by the Washington and London treaties were now entirely removed, and the new class would only be limited by logistical restrictions of existing naval infrastructure, most significantly of which being the size of the Panama Canal and available dry docks. In October, the General Board asked for new 12-gun designs that were sufficiently armored. It was estimated that this could be accomplished with a displacement of around 50,000 tons. The Bureau of Construction and Repair responded with a design in mid-January 1940 that largely met the General Board's requirements. During a meeting in February, the board requested another series of new proposals, which included a modified version of the 9-gun Iowa design that was 2 knots slower but better protected, an enlarged Iowa variant that maintained the 33-knot speed but displaced 53,500 tons, and several 12-gun designs that had speeds ranging from 28 to 33 knots. Some of the displacements of these proposals increased to as much as 67,000 tons. All of these designs were armed with the 16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 gun used on the Iowas, and all were well protected against the new armor-piercing shell. During discussions in March, the decision was made to revert to externally applied belt armor, since the internal armor belts of the South Dakota and Iowa classes were more difficult to install and repair, and the weight savings associated with it no longer mattered now that displacement limits were gone. By July, the Navy's senior leadership still could not agree on design priorities. The board requested another round of design studies, again including slow and fast variants of the design. Plans were finally approved by Knox on August 19th, and detailed work on the design continued into 1941, which included replacing the original main battery of anti-aircraft guns, which were to be the ineffective 1.1-inch Chicago piano guns, with Bofor's 40mm guns. Searchlights were reconfigured, the navigational rangefinders were removed, and the hull length was increased slightly to 890 feet. Displacement was also increased slightly to 60,500 tons. It was discovered that the propulsion system could be reduced in power, from 212,000 to 172,000 shaft horsepower, which allowed smaller and lighter propulsion machinery. These changes provided further savings in weight that allowed the bomb deck to be extended further aft, and improvements to the anti-aircraft battery. This design was immune to 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells when fired at ranges between 18,000 and 31,000 yards. The design was finally agreed upon by all parties in March 1941. The Navy planned to build 4 ships utilizing the new design, as this would have constituted a single battleship division, but 5 were actually authorized by Congress in July 1940. Work was intended to begin 1941, but shortages of the necessary steel caused delays. These shortages also caused a delay in the building of the Panama Canal locks that would accommodate these ships. The final contract design was issued in June 1942. Construction was authorized by Congress, and the projected date of completion was estimated to be somewhere between July and November 1945. When completed, the class would have consisted of 5 ships: Montana, BB-67, Ohio, BB-68, Maine, BB-69, New Hampshire, BB-70, and Louisiana, BB-71. As authorized, these ships would have had a waterline length of 890 feet and an overall length of 921 feet, 3 inches. At the waterline, their beam was to have been 115 feet wide, with their maximum beam being over 121 feet. The ships would have had a standard displacement of 60,500 tons, with a full load displacement of almost 71,000 tons. At their standard displacement, the ships would have had a draft of 35 feet. Their projected crew was to be 115 officers and 2,240 enlisted men. This grew to 189 officers and 2,789 enlisted men when serving as a flagship. The main battery of the Montana class would have consisted of 12 16-inch, 50-caliber Mark VII guns, which were to be housed in 4 3-gun turrets. The turrets were placed in 2 super-firing pairs, one forward and one aft. The guns fired 2 types of shells: 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells and 1,900-pound high-capacity shells that carried a larger high-explosive charge. The armor-piercing shells, fired at maximum elevation, could reach targets over 24 miles away, while the lighter high-capacity shells had a slightly reduced range of 23.6 miles. The shells had a flight time in excess of 80 seconds at those distances. At an engagement distance of 20,000 yards, the armor-piercing shells could penetrate 20 inches of armor. The guns had a rate of fire of 2 shots per minute and had a rate of train of 4 degrees per second. They had to be returned to 5 degrees elevation for reloading. The secondary armament for the Montana class was to be 20 5-inch, 54-caliber, Mark 16 dual-purpose guns, specifically designed for the Montana class, were housed in 10 twin-barrel turrets located amidships, 5 on each side, just as in previous U.S. battleship class designs. They were intended to improve the effective range over the shorter-barreled Mark 12 guns then in service. They fired a 70-pound projectile and had a maximum range of almost 26,000 yards against surface targets and a maximum ceiling of 51,600 feet against aerial targets. Each barrel had a rate of fire of 15 shots per minute. Each ship would have carried an anti-aircraft armament of 32 40mm Bofors guns and 20 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. The Bofors guns were to be carried in 8 quadruple mounts, while the Oerlikons were to have been mounted individually. I do believe by late 1945, when these ships would have come online, that they would have had considerably more AA guns added, probably a few more Bofors mounts, and the twin Oerlikon mounts that were being used by then. As designed, the Montanas used the all-or-nothing armor philosophy, with most of the armor concentrated on the citadel that includes the machinery spaces, armament, magazines, and command and control facilities. They would have had a Class A armor belt up to 16.1 inches thick and inclined at 19 degrees, deck armor up to 7.35 inches thick, and 22.5 inches of armor on their turret faces. Their barbettes were protected by 21.3 inches of armor. To protect against potential underwater shell hits, the ships would have a separate lower belt of Class B armor, 8.5 inches thick and inclined at 10 degrees. This lower belt would taper to 1 inch at the triple bottom. Montana's torpedo protection incorporated lessons learned from those of previous U.S. fast battleships, and due to the external armor belt, was more similar to that of the North Carolina class than that of the South Dakota and Iowa classes. The Montana class would have been powered by 4 geared steam turbines, each driving 1 propeller shaft, and using steam provided by 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox 2-drum boilers. Rated for 172,000 shaft horsepower, their turbines would have produced a top speed of 28 knots, and they would have had a cruising range of 15,000 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. The ships of the Montana-class would have had the latest radars and communication equipment installed, similar to that of other U.S. battleships in service at the time. This would more than likely include the SK Air Search and SG Surface Search sets. They would have also had the appropriate fire control directors and fire control radar sets installed. The final Montana-class design shares many characteristics with the previous classes of American fast battleships, starting with the North Carolina-class. These include a bulbous bow, a triple bottom under the armored citadel, and twin skegs in which the inner shafts were housed. The Montana's overall construction would have made extensive use of welding for joining structural plates and homogeneous armor, which saved weight compared to traditional riveting. Like all of the U.S. interwar designs, the Montanas would have had a flush main deck that was steeply flared at the bow to reduce the amount of water taken on in heavy seas. The Montana-class would have carried 3 aircraft for reconnaissance and gunnery spotting. They would have been operated from catapults on the ship's fantail, as was standard for U.S. battleship designs of the period. In October 1942, work on the ships was again delayed by an order for destroyers, which were badly needed for the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats. Additional work on the design continued into 1942, but all 5 ships were ultimately canceled on July 21, 1943, as U.S. Navy production priorities had shifted decisively toward carriers, destroyers, and submarines. The time spent refining the Montana design was not entirely a waste, as the arrangement of the propulsion system was modified and used in the Midway-class aircraft carriers that were commissioned just after the end of the war. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more insightful content just like this.